interestingly enough, Frank Meyer didn't start out as a conservative. In fact, he started out very much on the opposite side of the political spectrum. One of the interesting theses that Daniel Flynn, the author of the new biography of Frank Meyer, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, puts forth in his book, is that Meyer Today I want to talk about an important chapter in the history of American conservatism. It's a chapter that in fact could help inform today's debates about what the meaning of conservatism and the American right is. This chapter in American conservatism is about a man by the name of Frank Meyer. Meyer was an influential voice in the very founding of the American conservative movement in the post-war era of the 20th century. But interestingly enough, Frank Meyer didn't start out as a conservative. In fact, he started out very much on the opposite side of the political spectrum. For Frank Meyer was in fact a communist and a very prolific communist activist very early on in his career in the earlier part of the 20th century. Now, in addition to recording this podcast and publishing Modern Age, I'm also in charge of ISI Books, which is the publishing imprint of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And ISI Books has just brought out a new volume, a biography in fact, of Frank Meyer called The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. Now, just to give a very brief summary of Meyer's importance for the conservative movement, he becomes one of the early editors at National Review magazine, and in the pages of National Review, he engages in debates with traditionalists and with other friends, some of whom are libertarians, some of whom are perhaps social conservatives, and he tries to bring them together. He tries to unite conservatives behind a philosophy which is called, mostly by its critics, fusionism. As far as Frank Meyer was concerned, the conservatism that he was trying to describe was not, in fact, a fusion of completely alien elements consisting of libertarianism and social traditionalism. Rather, Frank Meyer believed that there was a consistent organic unity to conservatism, but that it had, over time, different degrees of emphasis on either liberty or virtue. And unfortunately, according to Meyer, in the 19th century, there was a split in the great Western tradition, which led the proponents of liberty and the proponents of virtue to see one another as enemies and as rivals. And while the tradition of virtue and liberty was divided in the 19th century, there arose a new and malevolent force called socialism and ultimately, of course, communism. You had the opportunity for the left and for radicalism in general to fill the void that was taken up by the division among the forces of liberty and tradition and virtue. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. If you enjoy this podcast, you should also check out Modern Age as an online publication at www.modernAgeJournal.com, and also buy our print magazine, which is available every 3 months. It's a quarterly publication, and you can subscribe on our website, modernAgeJournal.com. Now, Frank Meyer, as I said, actually does not begin as a conservative. He gets started as a communist. He is a Jewish American born in Newark, New Jersey in 1909. He soon falls out of love with his old faith. He is a devoted Reform Jew at the very beginning of his life, during his childhood, but he loses his faith and he loses touch with his ancestral tradition. And instead he's drawn first to secularism, first to a rebellion against all authority, and then ultimately to a kind of organized rebellion against authority in the form of communism in the early 20th century. Keep in mind, this is a point in world history when communism seems to be ascendant. You've had the Russian Revolution, you've had the creation of the Soviet Union. It seems as if revolutions might spring up everywhere around the world, in Europe and elsewhere, and that communism is going to be the wave of the future. It's a very exciting time, and communism at this point has not been so long established in the USSR that it has fully revealed its face to the entire world. And in fact, a lot of people who wish to be fooled by communism in the early 20th century can still tell themselves that communism is an idealistic movement, that it's not tyrannical, that it's not about crushing the individual beneath the weight of the state and the party, that instead, if there are any problems in the Soviet Union, they're simply growing pains from the establishment of a new and more just order. So communism had a very romantic appeal to young men in the early 20th century, and Frank Meyer was one of those who was seduced by the ideology of communism. He joins the American Communist Party, but he also goes to work for communist parties in Europe. And in fact, he's sent to Britain as a graduate student, to Oxford University first of all, and then later to the London School of Economics, where Meyer, acting as an American communist in Britain, is in fact a remarkably successful organizer. He, creates a new wave of Marxist sympathy at Oxford University. He circulates with the great and good of British society. He even dates the Prime Minister's daughter. Frank Meyer, this American Jew who is in fact a communist at this time, and an open communist at that, is a remarkably influential figure in British circles in the early 20th century. And of course, British intelligence doesn't take this lying down. They follow Frank Meyer, they open his mail, and ultimately Frank Meyer gets deported from Britain because of his communist activism and subversion. He eventually goes back to America, and the American Communist Party in the early 20th century is having something of an identity crisis. Now, many viewers and listeners will have heard of the term American exceptionalism, and usually when you hear the term American exceptionalism, it might be conservatives or people who are from the center of the political spectrum who are talking about America's virtues as being a kind of American exceptionalism. Interestingly enough, however, the term American exceptionalism actually has origins in the Communist Party, and particularly in the problem that communists faced in trying to explain America's political order within the context of Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. So Karl Marx and then his followers developed a theory of history according to which feudalism, which Europe, of course, had experienced in the Middle Ages, would then be succeeded by capitalism. And within capitalism, there would be intractable conflicts between labor and management, labor and ownership, that would ultimately lead to class conflicts that would lead to a revolution. And the Communist Party would eventually develop in all parts of the world, especially the industrialized world, as the organ or the representation of the workers' concerns. The proletariat would naturally give rise to communist parties everywhere, starting with the most advanced capitalist countries in the world. And again, that's because, according to the Marxist theory, the natural conflict between workers and owners would lead to an escalating degree of unhappiness, political conflict, even violence, and the Communist Party would be what workers would gather around as their champion in this conflict. Now, the problem was that by the early 20th century, it was clear that this was not actually happening in America. Communist theorists had to explain why it was that America was not experiencing the degree of class conflict that Marxist theory said should be occurring. Why was it that, in fact, socialist parties, and especially the Communist Party, were struggling in America to recruit workers and to have the kind of mass presence that communist parties often had in continental Europe? Well, a thinker by the name of J. Lovestone, who was a communist and a socialist activist, a labor activist, he came up with a theory to explain this. He said that because of the unique way that America had been settled in during the colonial period and on through until the closing of the frontier in the 19th century, because of the way America had been settled, where there was plentiful land available for all the settlers, for all Americans, you did not have the kind of feudalism that had existed in Europe. And so, in effect, America was an exception to Karl Marx's theory of history. America was on a separate track and a separate path that, because it didn't have the kind of feudalism the old world had, it also did not develop the same kind of capitalism, and it did not develop, therefore, the kind of socialist reaction to capitalism that Europe was seeing. Now, there were other threads to this idea as well, that because American capitalism also produced more opportunities for Americans than the economic systems of Europe were producing for Europeans, there was also a certain capitalist safety valve and other kinds of safety valves that were letting off the class conflict pressures that normally, according to Marxist theory, would lead to class conflicts that would create a communist party and a broad socialist movement. So that was one theory that the Communist Party had in the early 20th century, particularly in the 1920s, to explain why America was not experiencing the class conflict and the rise of socialism that was apparent in Europe. Into the 1930s, which is when Frank Meyer becomes deeply involved in the communist movement, American communists were under orders from Moscow. They were under orders from Stalin and the Comintern to take a very pro-American stance in their propaganda. Now, it's not that Stalin was won over by J. Lovestone's idea of American exceptionalism. In fact, Stalin actually winds up excommunicating Lovestone from the communist movement, rather, because he says that, in fact, this idea of American exceptionalism is a heresy within the faith of Marxism, and that you cannot have this idea of a separate track of history being pursued in America apart from what you had in Europe and other parts of the world. That, in fact, America had to be on the same track as the rest of the world. Nevertheless, as a practical matter, Stalin saw it as very important to have allies in America and as many allies as possible, and so he directed the American Communist Party to adopt a strategy of infiltration in which the American Communist Party would try to create alliances with non-communist elements within the country, including liberals, including people in the Democratic Party, throughout American society, even within churches, within the labor movement, all throughout American society. Now, the people in charge of the American Communist Party at this time come up with the idea of trying to present communism as what they call, quote, 20th century Americanism. This is an idea that is associated with a communist named Earl Browder, and they make the Communist Party USA in the 1930s what they claim to be an embodiment of 20th century Americanism. Communism is 20th century Americanism. And of course, part of the reason for this strategy is that Stalin knows that World War II is coming. He wants America to be at least neutral, if not actually on his side. And in order to arrange that, he has to have influence. He has to have communist influence within large strata of American society, including within politics, including within liberal organizations, and the Democratic Party. So there's a foreign policy element of this, as well as an attempt simply to grow the membership of the Communist Party. And in fact, for the Comintern and for Stalin, it's less important in the 1930s to grow the numbers of the Communist Party itself than it is to create the idea that communism is compatible with Americanism. This is the period when Frank Meyer is very closely involved and, in fact, is a member of the American Communist Party. And so he's trying to work out ideological formulas and propagandic, forms of rhetoric that are going to convince Americans that, yes, communism is an idea that can be fit into the American tradition. And of course, this proves to be impossible. And very soon, some of the communists who are working on this effort realize that it's impossible. Nevertheless, they have to persist because Stalin insists on it. And as World War II breaks out, Stalin is all the more eager to make it seem as if communism is compatible with the New Deal and with Franklin Roosevelt and with his ally, who will eventually be his ally in the Second World War against Hitler. So Stalin, for a long time, has this interest in seeing communism branded as a form of Americanism, as being compatible with American patriotism. Now, this lasts until the end of World War II, when Stalin suddenly changes his mind about the strategy that communism is going to pursue around the world. And Stalin sends a memo. Actually, he has a French communist send out a memo under his name rather than under Stalin's name. The communists can be very Machiavellian and like to disguise who is actually laying down the law for the entire party. But in fact, it was Joseph Stalin, not Jacques Duclos, who is the leader of the French Communist Party, who was responsible for setting a new party line after World War II, saying that communists are no longer going to cooperate with patriotic movements in Western countries, especially America, and that communism is now going to once again unveil itself, take off the mask, and present itself as a revolutionary force that wants to overthrow society. Now, Frank Meyer, during this whole time, has growing doubts about communism. He reads, for example, Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. He looks at the alliance that Stalin has with Hitler before Stalin becomes an ally of the United States against Hitler. He looks at these compromises in foreign policy. He looks at the reality of communist tyranny. And he also serves in the United States military during World War II and has the experience. Now, Frank Meyer's service is very brief in the military, but nevertheless, it is enough for him to get a sense of real Americans, real working class Americans. Frank Meyer himself actually came from a very upper middle class background. He was quite wealthy. Really, it's entering the United States military that gives Frank Meyer an experience for the first time with the kind of people that the communists normally referred to as the proletariat or the working class. And it's a revelation for Frank Meyer, because he finds that in fact the working class is not looking to have a communist revolution. They are not inspired by the ideals of Marxism. On the contrary, working class people are highly patriotic, they love their country, and they really want to preserve their faith and their family, and they want to prosper. They want to have success within a capitalist economy. They don't want to overthrow it. So Frank Meyer, over time, comes to see that not only has the project of hybridizing communism and Americanism failed, but that in fact Americanism is a repudiation by its very nature of the whole communist enterprise, that Americans reject the atheism of communism, Americans certainly reject the economic system of communism, and Americans reject the internationalism and the opposition to borders that is characteristic of international communism. So Frank Meyer leaves communism, and he begins to get involved in arguments among libertarians, arguments among conservatives, arguments against the New Deal, as well as anti-communist arguments. And because of Frank Meyer's own experience with the Communist Party, he realizes that the Communist Party is a very serious subversive threat within America and within the West. So it's not simply that America is facing the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There's also an internal conflict that's happening in America. And Meyer's also sensitive to the fact that you have communist infiltration of liberal organizations and the Democratic Party, and that you have not just actual infiltration of spies and, fellow travelers, but also communist ideas are starting to seep into the American mainstream through a corrupted liberalism and through the corruptions of the Democratic Party. So Frank Meyer becomes a very strong anti-communist, and he's someone who wants to really highlight the extent to which America has a tradition of liberty as well as virtue that is antithetical to communism itself. And so it's, one of the interesting theses that Daniel Flynn, the author of the new biography of Frank Meyer, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, puts forth in his book, is that Meyer learned from his experience in communism, including this failed attempt to rebrand communism as 20th century Americanism. From that, Frank Meyer learns that you need to talk about the American tradition in a way that shows that conservatism and Americanism are one and the same, that they are in fact a union, that there are not these radical fragments called libertarianism or traditionalism that represent something antithetical to America and something different, something is alien to America in their own ways, as communism is. Rather, Frank Meyer says that in fact, conservatism, with both its libertarian and its traditionalist emphases, is a natural part of the American project, and not just the American project, but in fact, this kind of dual emphasis on both tradition and liberty is something that is consistent with Western civilization, certainly going back to the Middle Ages, and in some respects going back all the way to Socrates. This is in fact the origin of Frank Meyer's idea of fusionism. And again, fusionism is something of a misnomer. It's not meant to be a uniting of disparate and conflicting elements. It's rather meant to be showing the organic wholeness, the fact that the Western tradition and the American political tradition has a natural right hand and a left hand. It has both virtue and liberty, and it has always had a certain tension between them, but that tension is something that has actually made the West and made America stronger and more capable of combating not just communism, but all forms of left-wing radicalism. Now, Frank Meyer is sometimes taken to be a much more libertarian conservative rather than a traditionalist, but that's not necessarily how Meyer saw himself. And in fact, Meyer, who dies in around 1972, is horrified by the rise of the New Left, by the rise of the sex, drug, and rock and roll culture of the hippies, by the counterculture of the 1960s. Meyer considers all of this to be a lethal threat to not just America, but to Western civilization as a whole, in fact, to the very philosophical and moral foundations of that civilization, that the hedonism and the relativism that are characteristic of this new movement on the American left and throughout the West, in fact, is something that is going to lead to a cultural revolution that is going to be just as dangerous, perhaps, as a communist economic revolution. And of course, these two things are working together because the New Left of the 1960s and the 1970s, while it does have some criticisms of the Soviet Union, is in fact very favorable towards Mao Zedong's communist China and very favorable towards Che Guevara, towards revolutionary communist Cuba, and to other forms of communism. And we see even today, in the 21st century, that you still have a socially hedonistic and relativistic left that is very favorable towards communism wherever it springs up in the world. Now, Frank Meyer's project becomes controversial among conservatives, even though it also becomes something like what Meyer calls the conservative mainstream. So throughout the late 20th century, towards the end of the Cold War, most conservatives do in fact think of themselves as fusionists following Frank Meyer's philosophy. But since the end of the Cold War, things have become more complicated, and some of the conflicts between those who emphasize liberty within the Western tradition and those who emphasize virtue have become harder to reconcile. And so we've seen questions like free trade, questions like the regulation of pornography and libel laws become flashpoints once again between those who have a libertarian emphasis and those who have a traditionalist emphasis on the right. Nevertheless, what Frank Meyer was arguing about the common root of both those who emphasize liberty and those who emphasize tradition remains true. And it's the case that even traditionalists have a strong sense of liberty, and it's true that libertarians, at least those who are more conservative libertarians, understand the need for virtue if you're going to have a society that is characterized by wide-ranging freedom, that these two things in fact fit together and reinforce one another. Now, it's worth thinking about the way in which in the 20th century, the centralized state, which libertarians in general dislike, they do not like federal government power, they do not like government power in general, but centralized federal power is even worse than most other kinds. That centralized power was used generally to promote a hard left agenda in terms of society. That usually most of the rulings that would create pornography being legal throughout America, that would create an abortion regime in Roe v. Wade that would be imposed on the whole country, these are rulings by federal courts that are in fact overruling and traducing the independence or the local virtues and laws of our states, and that decentralization, something that libertarians tend to favor, would in fact, in the context of the 20th century, also favor social conservatism. Now, in the 21st century, things have reached a point where it's much less clear that that's always the case, and yet it's still worth considering that the Catholic moral tradition, the Catholic political tradition, as well as its view of Catholic social teaching and economics, Catholicism also emphasizes the need for what's called subsidiarity, and that decisions and responsibility should be made at the lowest level possible. They should be made closest to the family itself. Now, that's not to say that every decision can be made at the lowest level. There are, of course, proper functions for the federal government. There are proper functions for the Pope as an instructor for Catholics all around the world. So it's certainly not the case that within the conservative tradition, within the American tradition, or within the Catholic tradition, that everything is always about decentralization and an avoidance of central political power or central regulatory power. But in general, conservatives, Catholics, Christians of many other denominations, and libertarians all share a skepticism of concentrated power, especially when that concentrated power is placed in the hands of progressives, as it almost always has been since the French Revolution, and that power is then used to transform society almost as radically, or perhaps even more radically in some ways, than the communists themselves had envisioned.